Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, a modern-day battle was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. It wasn't fought with swords or armies, but with whispered conversations in marble corridors, carefully planted stories in tabloid newspapers, and a campaign so subtle yet devastating that it would drive a beloved prince and his wife to abandon everything they had ever known. This is the untold story of how an American actress named Meghan Markle walked into a fairy tale and discovered it was actually a nightmare designed to protect an ancient institution at any cost. What she didn't know was that from the moment she said "I do" to Prince Harry, powerful forces within the royal establishment had already decided she was a threat that needed to be contained, controlled, or ultimately eliminated from the picture. The question wasn't whether Meghan would survive the royal machine, it was how far that machine would go to preserve itself, even if it meant destroying one of their own princes in the process. This is the story of manipulation, media warfare, and the lengths to which the world's most famous family would go to maintain their image, told through the eyes of those who witnessed it all unfold. The first signs of trouble appeared long before anyone realized what was happening. Meghan Markle had spent years building a successful career as an actress, humanitarian, and lifestyle blogger. She was educated, accomplished, and had already experienced life in the public eye. When she met Prince Harry on a blind date in London in July 2016, neither of them could have predicted that their love story would become the center of a constitutional crisis. Harry had always been the spare heir, the fun-loving prince who could get away with things his older brother William never could. He served in Afghanistan, partied in Las Vegas, and dated whoever he wanted without much interference from the palace machinery. The royal establishment had grown comfortable with Harry as the charming rebel who drew positive attention while never threatening the line of succession. But Meghan was different from Harry's previous girlfriends. She wasn't from British high society or European aristocracy. She was an American who had spoken openly about politics, feminism, and social justice. She was mixed race in an institution that had never welcomed diversity at its highest levels. Most threatening of all, she was independent and successful in her own right, with her own opinions and her own platform. The first meeting between Meghan and senior royal staff took place in early 2017, months before their engagement was announced. According to sources close to the palace, the conversation was polite but tense. Meghan had prepared thoroughly, researching royal protocol and history. She asked intelligent questions about her potential role and how she could contribute to the monarchy's charitable work. But the royal courtiers saw something else entirely. They saw an American actress who didn't understand the delicate balance of royal life, someone who might upset the carefully maintained relationships with the British press and political establishment. More concerning was her background in activism and her willingness to speak out on controversial topics. The palace's communication strategy had always been based on control. Every public appearance, every interview, every photograph was carefully planned and executed. The royal family's relationship with the British tabloid press was complex but manageable. Give them enough access and exclusive stories to keep them happy, and they would generally protect the institution when it mattered. Meghan's arrival threatened this delicate ecosystem. She had grown up in Hollywood, where celebrities routinely used their platforms to advocate for causes they believed in. She had written about politics, gender equality, and racial justice on her lifestyle blog. To her, speaking out was natural and necessary. To the palace establishment, it was dangerous and uncontrollable. The warning signs became apparent during Meghan and Harry's first official engagement together in Nottingham in September 2017. Meghan was poised, articulate, and genuinely interested in the people she met. The crowds loved her, and the initial media coverage was overwhelmingly positive. But, behind the scenes, palace staff were already expressing concerns about her approach. She asked too many questions during briefings. She wanted to understand the deeper issues behind the charities they were visiting rather than simply following the script. She suggested changes to events that would make them more meaningful and impactful. To Meghan, these seemed like reasonable requests from someone trying to do her job well. To the courtiers, they represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how things worked. The British tabloid press initially embraced Meghan as a breath of fresh air for the royal family. Headlines proclaimed her a breath of fresh air and praised her style, intelligence, and charitable background. But, even in those early positive stories, there were subtle undertones that would later become full-blown attacks. References to her exotic background, descriptions of her as almost straight out of Compton, and emphasis on her divorce status planted seeds that would later grow into more vicious coverage. The palace communications team, led by seasoned professionals who had managed royal crises for decades, began developing what they would later call a media strategy for Meghan. In reality, it was a containment protocol. Rather than allowing Meghan to develop her own authentic voice as Catherine had been permitted to do gradually, they sought to fit her into a predetermined mold. Meghan's friend from her acting days recalls a conversation from this period. "She called me one night, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. She said it felt like she was being managed rather than supported. Every idea she had was met with, 'That's not how we do things,' or 'That's not possible.' She understood there were protocols, but she couldn't understand why her experience and perspective weren't valued." The engagement announcement in November 2017 marked a turning point. The official engagement interview, conducted by the BBC, was carefully scripted and went off without incident. Meghan spoke about her excitement to join the royal family and her commitment to supporting Harry and the Queen. But, privately, the tensions were escalating. Palace insiders began briefing selected journalists with concerns about Meghan's demanding nature and her American approach to royal duties. These stories were subtle at first, mentions of her arriving early to meetings with detailed agendas, her requests for briefings on the historical context of royal patronages, her questions about why certain protocols existed. The wedding planning process became a battleground. Meghan had clear ideas about what she wanted for her wedding, influenced by her background in event planning and her desire for the ceremony to reflect both her and Harry's personalities and values. The palace, however, saw the wedding as a state occasion that needed to follow centuries of tradition. Every decision became a negotiation. Meghan wanted a diverse choir that would reflect modern Britain. Palace officials worried about departing too dramatically from tradition. She wanted her mother to walk her partway down the aisle. Protocol experts insisted only her father could fill that role. She wanted flowers that held personal meaning. The florists argued for arrangements that would photograph well for the official portraits. The most significant battle came over Meghan's wedding speech. She had prepared remarks thanking the British people for welcoming her and outlining her vision for her role as a working royal. The palace communications team reviewed the speech and requested multiple revisions, ultimately suggesting she not speak at all, as royal brides traditionally remain silent during wedding celebrations. Harry reportedly fought for Meghan's right to speak at their own wedding, but the palace ultimately prevailed. The decision would later be seen as a symbolic moment, the first major instance of Meghan's voice being silenced by the institution she was joining. Meanwhile, the British tabloid press was beginning to shift its tone. Stories that had once praised Meghan's fashion choices now criticized them as too expensive or inappropriate. Her family background, which had initially been portrayed as charmingly American, was now being investigated and exploited for negative coverage. Her half-siblings began giving interviews criticizing her character and their relationship. The palace's response to this changing media narrative was telling. Rather than defending Meghan or attempting to correct false stories, they remained largely silent. This was consistent with their traditional approach of never complain, never explain, but it left Meghan exposed to increasingly vicious attacks without institutional support. Royal biographer Tom Henderson observed the situation from inside palace circles. There was definitely a feeling among some courtiers that Meghan needed to be taught her place. They had expected someone who would be grateful for the opportunity and willing to be molded into whatever shape the institution required. Instead, they got someone with her own ideas and the confidence to express them. The week before the wedding, the situation reached a crisis point. Meghan's father, Thomas Markle, was caught staging paparazzi photographs and subsequently suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. The media frenzy intensified, with reporters camping outside the hospital and speculating about whether he would attend the wedding. Palace officials presented Meghan with a stark choice: either convince her father to attend despite the scandal, or proceed without any family member walking her down the aisle. When she suggested that her mother could fill the role, she was told it would be unprecedented and potentially controversial. The solution, having Prince Charles walk her down the aisle, was presented as a gracious gesture from the royal family. But, for Meghan, it represented another instance of her desires and traditions being overruled by palace protocol. She agreed because she felt she had no other choice, but friends say the incident left her feeling isolated and unsupported. The wedding itself, on May 19, 2018, was a global spectacle watched by millions. The ceremony was beautiful, incorporating elements of both British and American culture, with a gospel choir and an African-American preacher delivering a sermon about love. For the watching world, it seemed like a perfect fairy tale beginning. But, behind the scenes, palace staff were already documenting what they called concerns about Meghan's behavior during the wedding week. She was described as difficult for requesting last-minute changes to accommodate her father's absence. Her emotional state during what was obviously a traumatic time was characterized as demanding and unreasonable. These internal reports would later be leaked to sympathetic journalists as evidence of Meghan's unsuitability for royal life. But, at the time, they remained within palace walls, contributing to a growing file of grievances that would eventually be used to justify the campaign against her. The honeymoon period after the wedding lasted exactly 3 months. During the summer of 2018, Meghan and Harry carried out their first joint royal tours, visiting Ireland and later traveling to Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and Tonga for the Invictus Games. The tours were successful by every measure: enthusiastic crowds, positive media coverage, and effective diplomatic outcomes. But, within the palace, a different narrative was taking shape. Reports began circulating about Meghan's high-maintenance requirements, her requests for specific accommodations, and her American approach to royal duties. These stories were carefully crafted to sound reasonable while painting a picture of someone who didn't understand or respect royal tradition. The truth, according to palace insiders who later spoke anonymously, was more complex. Meghan was indeed asking questions and making suggestions that challenged how things had always been done. But, rather than seeing this as valuable input from someone with relevant experience, the establishment viewed it as evidence that she didn't understand her place. As 2018 drew to a close, the battle lines were being drawn for a conflict that would ultimately consume the Sussex brand, damage the monarchy's reputation, and drive Harry and Meghan from their royal roles. The American actress who had walked into Buckingham Palace believing she could help modernize an ancient institution was beginning to realize that the institution had no interest in being modernized, especially not by her. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the true nature of palace politics and the lengths to which the royal establishment would go to protect itself, even at the cost of destroying one of its own princes and the woman he loved. The golden cage was closing, and Meghan was starting to understand that her choice was to accept it quietly or fight back, knowing that fighting back against the crown was a battle very few had ever won. By January 2019, the honeymoon was definitively over. What had started as whispered concerns in palace corridors had evolved into a coordinated campaign to undermine Meghan's reputation and credibility. The transformation was so systematic and thorough that those watching from the outside could barely recognize the same woman who had been celebrated just months earlier. The shift began with small details that seemed insignificant individually but created a pattern when viewed together. Stories appeared about Meghan's treatment of staff, describing her as demanding and difficult to work with. These reports were always attributed to unnamed palace sources, making them impossible to verify or refute. The timing was strategic; they appeared just frequently enough to keep the narrative alive without seeming like an organized campaign. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, later observed the pattern with the wisdom of someone who had experienced similar treatment. The palace has a way of managing problems that seems very gentle and proper from the outside. But, when you're the target, you realize how methodical and ruthless it can be. They don't destroy you with one big scandal, they erode you with 1,000 small cuts. The first major escalation came with reports about Meghan's relationship with palace staff. In February 2019, The Times published a story claiming that Meghan had driven 2 personal assistants to quit and had humiliated staff with her demands. The story was presented as investigative journalism, but the sources were entirely anonymous, and no specific incidents were described in detail. What made the story particularly damaging was not just its content, but its timing. It appeared just days before a major royal engagement, ensuring maximum media coverage and speculation. More significantly, it established a template that would be repeated dozens of times over the following months. Anonymous sources describing Meghan's difficult behavior without providing verifiable details or context. The palace's response to these stories was crucial and revealing. Rather than defending Meghan or investigating the leaks, senior communications staff remained silent. This silence was interpreted by the media as confirmation that the stories were true, or at least that the palace was unwilling to support Meghan against criticism. Behind the scenes, Harry was becoming increasingly frustrated with the institution he had served his entire life. Friends describe him as devastated by the palace's failure to protect his wife. He had grown up watching his mother, Princess Diana, face similar treatment from both the media and the royal establishment. He had promised himself he would never allow history to repeat itself. But Harry was discovering that his position within the royal hierarchy gave him limited power to influence how the palace managed media relations. The communication strategy was controlled by senior courtiers who reported directly to the monarch and her heir, not to junior royals like Harry. His protests were noted but largely ignored. The situation was particularly painful because Harry could see the double standard clearly. When similar stories had been written about Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, the palace had responded aggressively, threatening legal action and demanding corrections. Press officers had worked to build positive relationships with journalists covering Catherine, ensuring favorable coverage of her activities and achievements. With Meghan, the approach was strikingly different. Press officers seemed less available to provide context or push back against negative narratives. Photo opportunities were less carefully managed. Even positive stories about Meghan's charitable work or successful engagements received less palace support than similar stories about other royal family members. The contrast became even more apparent when both women were covered in the same story. A particularly infamous example appeared in November 2018, comparing how Meghan and Catherine had both touched their pregnant bellies in public. Catherine's gesture was described as tenderly cradling her bump, while Meghan's identical action was characterized as holding her bump in a non-regal fashion. These comparisons served multiple purposes for the palace communications strategy. They created a narrative of inappropriate behavior without requiring specific accusations. They suggested that Meghan didn't understand royal protocol while reinforcing Catherine's position as the perfect royal wife. Most importantly, they established the idea that there was something fundamentally wrong with how Meghan approached her royal role. The media's appetite for these comparison stories was insatiable. Tabloid editors discovered they could generate significant reader engagement by contrasting everything from fashion choices to body language. The palace, rather than discouraging these divisive narratives, seemed to enable them through selective briefings and strategic silence. Royal correspondent Victoria Arbiter witnessed the dynamic firsthand. There was definitely a shift in how palace press officers interacted with journalists covering Meghan versus those covering other family members. It was subtle but unmistakable. Questions about Meghan were met with less enthusiasm, fewer helpful details, and sometimes outright stonewalling. The most damaging stories often contained enough truth to seem credible while omitting crucial context that would have presented a more balanced picture. For example, reports about Meghan's early morning emails to staff were technically accurate. She did send detailed messages at 5 a.m. But the stories failed to mention that she was dealing with pregnancy insomnia and time zone differences from her international charitable work, or that she specifically requested staff not respond until normal working hours. Similarly, stories about her expensive taste in clothing accurately reported the cost of her outfits but ignored the economic impact of her fashion choices, which regularly led to sellouts and supported British designers and retailers. The palace had detailed statistics about this positive impact but rarely shared them with journalists writing about Meghan's wardrobe costs. The pregnancy announcement in October 2018 should have been a moment of pure celebration. Instead, it became another opportunity for criticism. Even the timing of the announcement during Harry and Meghan's arrival in Australia for their royal tour was characterized as attention-seeking, despite being standard practice for royal pregnancy announcements to coincide with major events. The coverage of Meghan's pregnancy revealed the extent to which negative narratives had become entrenched. Stories focused on her fashion choices being inappropriate for a pregnant woman, her decision to continue working throughout pregnancy, and speculation about her birth plans. Every choice was scrutinized and found wanting by anonymous sources claiming royal expertise. The baby shower in New York in February 2019 became a particularly intense focus of criticism. The event, organized by Meghan's friends from before her royal life, was described as ostentatious and unroyal. British tabloids calculated the cost of everything from the venue to the flower arrangements, presenting the celebration as evidence of Meghan's failure to understand royal values. The irony was not lost on observers who noted that royal baby showers were not traditional in Britain, meaning there was no established protocol for Meghan to follow. She was being criticized for participating in an American tradition with her American friends, essentially being punished for maintaining connections to her pre-royal life. Palace sources, speaking anonymously to favored journalists, expressed concern about the baby shower's optics. These quotes were carefully crafted to sound measured and reasonable while feeding the narrative that Meghan's judgment was questionable. The sources never acknowledged that the event was private, paid for by friends, and had no cost to British taxpayers. The systematic nature of the campaign became clear when multiple publications began running nearly identical stories with slightly different angles but similar anonymous quotes and talking points. Media analysts noted that the coordination suggested a central source providing guidance on how to frame stories about Meghan. This coordination extended to the timing of negative stories, which often appeared to coincide with positive news about Meghan's charitable work or successful engagements. When she launched a cookbook supporting the Hub Community Kitchen, stories about her demanding behavior dominated the headlines instead of coverage of her successful initiative. The birth of Archie in May 2019 should have marked a fresh start. Instead, it became another opportunity for criticism about everything from the choice of hospital to the decision to keep details private initially. Even the traditional post-birth photo call was criticized. When Meghan and Harry chose not to immediately pose on the hospital steps, it was characterized as a snub to tradition and the British public. The palace's handling of Archie's birth announcement revealed another layer of the institutional bias Meghan faced. While other royal births had been managed with careful attention to public interest and media relations, Archie's arrival was handled with less coordination and support. The result was confusion among journalists and criticism of the parents for supposedly mismanaging the announcement. Royal biographer Andrew Morton, who had witnessed similar campaigns during his coverage of Princess Diana, recognized the pattern. The palace has a well-established playbook for managing problem members of the royal family. They don't attack directly, they create conditions where the person becomes isolated, criticized, and eventually either conforms completely or removes themselves from the situation. By summer 2019, the isolation was becoming complete. Meghan's requests for meetings with senior palace officials were delayed or denied. Her suggestions for charitable initiatives were met with bureaucratic obstacles. Her attempts to address the negative media coverage directly were blocked by communications staff who insisted that royal protocol required silence in response to criticism. The psychological toll was becoming apparent to those close to the couple. Friends described Meghan as increasingly withdrawn and Harry as angry and frustrated with his family's failure to support his wife. The fairy tale wedding just over a year earlier seemed like a different lifetime. The final straw came with the revelation that palace communications staff were not only failing to defend Meghan against false stories but were actively briefing against her. Harry discovered that senior courtiers were providing negative information about his wife to journalists, using the cover of anonymous sources to damage her reputation while maintaining plausible deniability. The realization that his own family's staff were undermining his wife marked the beginning of the end of Harry and Meghan's relationship with the royal institution. The machine that was supposed to protect and support them had instead identified Meghan as a threat to be neutralized, and Harry as collateral damage in that campaign. The American actress who had entered the royal family believing she could contribute her skills and perspective to modernizing the monarchy was learning a harsh truth: the institution was not interested in change, especially change advocated by someone they viewed as an outsider. The golden prison was closing around her, and the only question now was whether she would submit to its constraints or find a way to escape before it destroyed her completely. The battle for Meghan's survival within the royal family was about to enter its final, most vicious phase, where the gloves would come off and the true nature of palace politics would be revealed for all to see. The autumn of 2019 marked the point of no return for Harry and Meghan's relationship with the royal establishment. What had been a subtle campaign of undermining and isolation was about to become an open war, with devastating consequences for all involved. The palace had made a calculated decision that Meghan represented a threat that could not be managed or controlled, only eliminated from the royal narrative entirely. The turning point came with Harry and Meghan's documentary interview for the ITV program Harry and Meghan, An African Journey, which aired in October 2019. The interview, conducted by Tom Bradby during their successful tour of southern Africa, was intended to be a positive piece highlighting their charitable work. Instead, it became a moment of raw honesty that exposed the depth of their struggle with royal life. When Bradby asked Meghan how she was coping with the intense scrutiny, her response was heartbreaking in its simplicity: "Not many people have asked if I'm okay." The vulnerability in her voice and the tears in her eyes revealed the emotional toll that months of negative coverage and palace isolation had taken on her mental health. Harry's portion of the interview was equally revealing. When asked about his relationship with his brother William, he admitted that they were on different paths and had good days and bad days. For the royal family, where public unity was paramount, this acknowledgement of tension was devastating. The palace's response to the documentary revealed the full extent of their hostility toward the couple. Rather than expressing concern for Meghan's well-being or Harry's obvious distress, senior courtiers briefed journalists that the couple had betrayed royal protocol by discussing their personal struggles publicly. Palace insiders told sympathetic reporters that the Queen was disappointed by the interview, and that senior royals viewed it as a cry for attention rather than a genuine plea for support. The briefings were designed to further isolate the couple and signal that expressing vulnerability was unacceptable within the royal context. The media response was swift and brutal. Tabloid newspapers that had spent months criticizing Meghan for everything from her fashion choices to her treatment of staff now attacked her for daring to admit that the criticism had affected her. Headlines accused her of self-pity and ingratitude, suggesting that someone who had married into privilege had no right to complain about its costs. The contrast with how other royal mental health struggles had been handled was stark. When William and Harry had spoken openly about their grief following their mother's death, they had been praised for breaking down stigmas and encouraging others to seek help. When Catherine had struggled with severe morning sickness during her pregnancies, the palace had actively managed the narrative to generate sympathy and understanding. But Meghan's admission of vulnerability was treated as weakness and manipulation. The double standard was so obvious that even traditionally supportive media outlets began questioning the fairness of the coverage she was receiving. Behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Meghan had been seeking professional help for what friends described as severe anxiety and depression, but even her therapy appointments became the subject of palace criticism. Senior staff questioned whether it was appropriate for a working royal to be seen entering a therapist's office, worried about the message it would send about the stability of the institution. Harry was increasingly isolated within his own family. His attempts to discuss the media treatment of his wife with his father and brother were met with suggestions that Meghan needed to toughen up and accept that negative coverage was part of royal life. When he pointed out that the coverage of Meghan was substantially different from the treatment other family members received, he was accused of being oversensitive and paranoid. The palace's communication strategy was becoming more aggressive and coordinated. Positive stories about other royal family members were strategically timed to overshadow any favorable coverage of Harry and Meghan. When the couple's charitable initiatives showed signs of success, palace sources would brief journalists about concerns regarding their approach or their departure from royal protocol. The Christmas period of 2019 became a particular focus of palace manipulation. Harry and Meghan's decision to spend the holidays privately with Meghan's mother in Canada was presented as a snub to the Queen and a rejection of royal tradition. Anonymous sources described the royal family as hurt and disappointed by their absence from the traditional Sandringham gathering. The reality was more complex. The couple had sought permission for private time after a particularly difficult year, and their request had initially been approved. However, palace communications staff ensured that their absence was portrayed as selfish and inappropriate, generating negative coverage even during what should have been a period of personal recovery. During their time in Canada, Harry and Meghan made the decision that would change everything. They concluded that their situation within the royal family was not sustainable and that they needed to find a different way forward. The constant criticism, the lack of institutional support, and the deliberate undermining of their work had convinced them that they could not continue in their current roles. The decision to seek a progressive new role within the royal family was not made lightly. They spent weeks consulting with advisors, researching precedents, and developing a detailed proposal for how they could continue to serve the crown while gaining some independence from the daily control of palace bureaucrats. Their proposal was thoughtful and well-researched. They suggested a model similar to other European royals who combined official duties with independent careers. They offered to continue their patronages and represent the Queen at selected events while also developing their own charitable initiatives and potentially earning independent income through appropriate ventures. The proposal was submitted to palace officials in late December 2019, with a request for discussions about implementation in the new year. Harry and Meghan expected negotiations, compromises, and perhaps some initial resistance. They did not expect the response they received. Palace officials did not simply reject their proposal, they refused to seriously consider it. Senior courtiers dismissed the idea as naive and unworkable, according to sources close to the discussions. More concerning, they made it clear that any attempt to modify their royal roles would be seen as a betrayal of their duty to the crown. The institutional response revealed the fundamental issue that had been driving the conflict all along. The palace was not interested in modernizing or adapting to accommodate different approaches to royal service. They required complete compliance with established protocols and total submission to institutional control. Any deviation was viewed as a threat to be suppressed. Harry's frustration reached a breaking point when he learned that palace officials were briefing journalists about his and Meghan's demands before they had even received a formal response to their proposal. The same anonymous sources that had been undermining Meghan for months were now characterizing their carefully considered suggestions as evidence of their unsuitability for royal life. The final betrayal came when Harry discovered that senior palace officials were not only refusing to consider their proposals but were actively planning for their departure. Internal documents later revealed that contingency plans for stripping Harry and Meghan of their royal roles had been developed even before their proposal was formally submitted. The realization that his own family's institution had already decided to push them out, while publicly maintaining the fiction that they were valued members of the royal team, was devastating for Harry. The betrayal was complete. Not only were they not going to receive the support they needed, but the palace was actively working to create conditions that would force their departure. The leak of their private discussions to the media was the final straw. On January 8, 2020, Harry and Meghan published their announcement that they intended to step back as senior members of the royal family. The statement, posted on their official Instagram account, was carefully worded to express their continued loyalty to the Queen while making clear their intention to seek independence. The palace's response was swift and harsh. Within hours, a statement was released saying that the royal family was disappointed and that complicated issues would need to be worked out. The language was diplomatically correct but unmistakably hostile, designed to suggest that Harry and Meghan had acted precipitously and without proper consultation. The media explosion that followed was unlike anything the royal family had experienced since the death of Princess Diana. The story dominated news cycles around the world, with every detail of the couple's relationship with the royal family scrutinized and analyzed. The palace found itself managing a crisis that threatened to expose the inner workings of an institution that depended on maintaining an image of unity and stability. Senior courtiers immediately began damage control, briefing sympathetic journalists that Harry and Meghan had blindsided the royal family with their announcement. Anonymous sources described the Queen as hurt and suggested that the couple had shown disrespect for the institution that had welcomed them. But the narrative was harder to control this time. Too many people had witnessed the systematic campaign against Meghan, and too many royal watchers had noticed the pattern of negative briefings and strategic silence. Questions were being asked about why a popular, successful member of the royal family had been driven to such desperate measures. The global response was particularly telling. While the British tabloid press largely supported the palace narrative, international media and public opinion were more sympathetic to Harry and Meghan's position. Their announcement resonated with millions of people who had watched them be criticized and undermined despite their obvious commitment to charitable work and royal duty. The crisis exposed fundamental questions about the nature of the modern monarchy and its ability to adapt to changing expectations. Harry and Meghan's departure was not just a personal family drama, it was a constitutional crisis that revealed the limitations of an ancient institution trying to maintain relevance in the 21st century. As the palace scrambled to contain the damage and Harry and Meghan prepared for an uncertain future, one thing was clear: the machine that had been designed to protect the monarchy had instead created its biggest crisis in decades. The campaign to eliminate Meghan as a threat had succeeded, but at a cost that would reverberate through the institution for years to come. The breaking point had been reached, and there would be no going back for any of them. The period between Harry and Meghan's announcement in January 2020 and their final departure from royal duties in March became the most vicious and revealing chapter in the entire saga. With their decision to leave now public, the palace felt free to unleash the full force of their institutional power to shape the narrative of their departure. What followed was a masterclass in royal damage control that prioritized protecting the institution over the well-being of two of its members. The Sandringham Summit on January 13, 2020, was presented to the public as a family meeting to discuss Harry and Meghan's future role. In reality, it was the formal negotiation of their surrender. The Queen, Prince Charles, Prince William, and Harry gathered at the royal estate to determine the terms under which the couple would be allowed to leave royal service. The meeting lasted several hours, but the outcome was predetermined. Harry later described feeling like he was facing a tribunal rather than participating in a family discussion. The other attendees had coordinated their position in advance, and he was presented with a series of non-negotiable demands disguised as compromises. The key points were clear: Harry and Meghan could leave royal service entirely, or they could remain and accept complete institutional control over their activities, finances, and public statements. There was no middle ground, no partial independence, and no gradual transition. The very proposal they had submitted weeks earlier was dismissed as impossible and inappropriate. Most devastating was the revelation that the family had already made their decision about the couple's future before the meeting began. Palace officials had spent weeks developing the framework for their departure, consulting with constitutional experts and preparing for various scenarios. The summit was not a negotiation, it was the formal delivery of an ultimatum. Harry's isolation during this process was complete. His brother William, once his closest confidant, had become a representative of the institutional position rather than a supportive family member. His father Charles, while expressing personal regret about the situation, made it clear that the monarchy's stability took precedence over Harry's happiness or Meghan's well-being. The Queen, whom Harry had always revered and who had shown genuine affection for Meghan during their early interactions, maintained the institutional line throughout the discussions. Her personal feelings, whatever they might have been, were subordinated to her role as monarch and protector of the crown's interests. The final agreement stripped Harry and Meghan of their royal titles, their official patronages, and their right to carry out royal duties. They would lose their security funding, their staff support, and their official residence. Most symbolically painful, they would no longer be able to use their Sussex royal brand, even though they had invested significant time and resources in developing charitable initiatives under that name. The announcement of these terms was carefully crafted to make the departing couple appear ungrateful and irresponsible. Palace communications emphasized that Harry and Meghan would no longer represent the Queen, suggesting they had abandoned their duty rather than been forced out by institutional hostility. The media coverage of the final agreement revealed the full extent of the palace's influence over the narrative. Stories appeared simultaneously across multiple publications with nearly identical talking points about the couple's demands being unreasonable and their departure being inevitable given their difficult behavior. Behind the scenes, palace officials were briefing journalists with increasingly personal and damaging information about Harry and Meghan. Stories appeared about their supposedly extravagant lifestyle, their treatment of staff, and their failure to understand royal protocol. Each story was attributed to anonymous sources but carried the unmistakable stamp of official authorization. The most revealing aspect of this briefing campaign was its timing and coordination. Negative stories about Harry and Meghan appeared on the same days as positive announcements about other royal family members, ensuring that the institutional message was clear: this is what happens when you challenge the system, and this is how we reward those who comply. The couple's final round of royal engagements in March 2020 became a bittersweet farewell tour that highlighted both their popularity with the public and their isolation within the institution. Their appearance at the Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey was particularly poignant, as they sat separately from the senior royals who had once welcomed them as valued family members. The visual symbolism was deliberate and cruel. Harry and Meghan were seated in the second row, behind working royals who were their juniors in the line of succession. They arrived separately from the other family members and left without the customary family interactions. The message was unmistakable: they were no longer truly part of the royal family. The public response to their final engagements revealed how disconnected the palace's narrative was from popular opinion. Crowds gathered enthusiastically to see Harry and Meghan, and their charitable events were successful and well received. The disconnect between their obvious effectiveness as working royals and the institutional decision to force their departure became increasingly apparent. International media coverage of this period was particularly critical of the palace's handling of the situation. Foreign journalists, less influenced by the traditional royal press pack, questioned why a popular and effective royal couple was being pushed out of the institution. The coverage raised uncomfortable questions about the monarchy's values and its treatment of diversity. The coronavirus pandemic, which began just as Harry and Meghan were completing their departure, provided an unexpected postscript to their royal careers. While they immediately committed to charitable work supporting pandemic relief efforts, the palace ensured that their contributions were not officially recognized or coordinated with other royal family activities. The contrast with how other royal family members' pandemic work was supported and publicized highlighted the institutional nature of the campaign against Harry and Meghan. Their charitable efforts were just as valuable and impactful as those of other royals, but they received no official recognition or coordination because they were no longer considered part of the royal team. The move to California marked not just a geographical relocation but a complete severing of ties with the British establishment. Harry and Meghan were now entirely on their own, without the institutional support that had protected and promoted other royal family members throughout their lives. The freedom they had sought came at an enormous cost. They lost not only their royal roles but also their security detail, their financial support, and their connection to the charitable organizations they had worked to support. Most painfully, Harry lost his military appointments and his ability to continue the veteran support work that had been central to his identity. The palace's victory in forcing their departure was complete, but it came with unexpected consequences. The global attention focused on their story had exposed aspects of royal operations that the institution preferred to keep private. Questions were being asked about the palace's treatment of Meghan, the role of the British press in royal public relations, and the monarchy's ability to adapt to modern expectations. The couple's departure also created a vacuum in royal activities that highlighted their value as working members of the family. They had been among the most popular and effective royals, particularly with younger audiences and in international contexts. Their absence left gaps in the monarchy's outreach and charitable work that were not easily filled. Most significantly, their story had resonated with millions of people around the world who saw parallels with their own experiences of institutional racism, workplace bullying, and family dysfunction. Harry and Meghan had become symbols of resistance against systems that prioritized tradition over justice and conformity over authenticity. The palace had succeeded in eliminating what they saw as a threat to royal stability, but they had created a different kind of threat in the process. Harry and Meghan's departure had generated more negative publicity for the monarchy than any scandal in recent memory, and their continuing presence as independent public figures meant the story was far from over. As they settled into their new life in California, Harry and Meghan began to speak more openly about their experiences within the royal family. Their platform was now independent of palace control, and they had stories to tell that the institution would prefer remained private. The final battle had been won by the palace, but the war for public opinion was just beginning. The machine that had been designed to protect the monarchy had instead created its most dangerous critics, armed with insider knowledge and a global platform to share their experiences. The question now was not whether Harry and Meghan would survive their departure from royal life; they clearly would. The question was whether the monarchy would survive the revelations about how it had treated them, and what those revelations would mean for an institution that depended on public respect and constitutional authority. The breaking point had been reached, the battle had been fought, and the casualties were being counted on all sides. But the story was far from over, and the most explosive revelations were yet to come. The bomb that would finally expose the true extent of the palace's campaign against Harry and Meghan was dropped on March 7, 2021, in the form of their interview with Oprah Winfrey. For 90 minutes, the couple sat in a California garden and systematically dismantled the narrative that the palace had spent years constructing about their departure. The revelations were so explosive that they sent shockwaves through the British establishment and forever changed how the world viewed the modern monarchy. The interview had been months in preparation, with Harry and Meghan carefully considering what they would and would not discuss. They understood that speaking publicly about their experiences would be seen as the ultimate betrayal by the royal family, but they had reached the conclusion that their silence had only enabled the institution to continue its campaign against them. Meghan's revelation that she had experienced suicidal thoughts during her pregnancy with Archie was perhaps the most devastating moment of the interview. Her description of seeking help from palace officials and being told that it would not be appropriate for her to seek professional mental health support exposed the institution's callous disregard for her well-being. The image of a pregnant woman, struggling with her mental health while being systematically attacked by the media, asking her husband's family for help and being refused, was profoundly damaging to the palace's reputation. It revealed an institution more concerned with maintaining its image than protecting one of its own members. Harry's description of his father stopping taking his calls and cutting off his financial support painted a picture of a family that prioritized institutional loyalty over personal relationships. The revelation that Harry had been forced to use his inheritance from his mother to fund his family's security and living expenses after leaving royal duties exposed the vindictive nature of the palace's response to their departure. But perhaps the most explosive revelation was Meghan's disclosure that there had been concerns and conversations within the royal family about how dark Archie's skin might be before he was born. This revelation of racism at the highest levels of the British establishment sent shockwaves around the world and forced a reckoning with the monarchy's relationship with race and diversity. The palace's response to the interview revealed the institution's panic and desperation. The statement released by Buckingham Palace acknowledged that the issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning but insisted that recollections may vary regarding the specific incidents described by Harry and Meghan. This phrase, "recollections may vary," became a symbol of the palace's inability to directly confront the truth about how they had treated the couple. Rather than apologizing or taking responsibility, they suggested that Harry and Meghan were misremembering or misinterpreting their experiences. The global reaction to the interview was immediate and damaging to the monarchy's reputation. Commonwealth countries, particularly those with significant populations of color, began questioning their relationship with a crown that appeared to harbor racist attitudes. Republican movements in Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean gained new momentum as the interview sparked conversations about the monarchy's relevance and values. The British media's response to the interview revealed the extent to which they had been complicit in the campaign against Meghan. Rather than examining their own role in the systematic harassment she had described, many publications doubled down on their criticism, suggesting that the couple was lying or exaggerating their experiences for sympathy. But the tide of public opinion was shifting. Younger audiences, in particular, were appalled by the treatment Meghan had described and increasingly skeptical of the palace's denials. Social media was filled with expressions of support for the couple and criticism of the royal family's handling of the situation. The interview also sparked a broader conversation about the role of the press in royal coverage and the relationships between palace officials and journalists. Harry's description of an invisible contract between the royal family and the tabloid press, where negative coverage of some family members was tolerated in exchange for positive coverage of others, exposed the manipulative nature of royal media management. Behind the scenes, the palace was in crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held to discuss how to respond to the ongoing damage from the interview. Senior courtiers who had orchestrated the campaign against Meghan found themselves under scrutiny as their tactics were exposed to public examination. The revelation that palace officials had actively briefed against Harry and Meghan while refusing to defend them against false stories fundamentally changed how royal press operations were viewed. The traditional narrative of palace officials as neutral civil servants protecting the monarchy was replaced by an understanding of their role as active participants in character assassination campaigns. The impact on individual royal family members was significant. William and Catherine faced increased scrutiny of their relationship with Harry and Meghan, with questions about whether they had been aware of or complicit in the institutional campaign. Charles's reputation as a progressive and caring father was damaged by revelations about his treatment of Harry during the crisis. The Queen, who had maintained personal popularity even as the institution faced criticism, found her legacy complicated by questions about her awareness of and response to the treatment of Meghan. The image of a grandmother failing to protect her granddaughter-in-law's mental health was profoundly damaging to her carefully maintained public image. The interview also exposed the international implications of the palace's actions. Harry and Meghan's popularity in the United States and their growing influence in American media and politics meant that the palace's campaign against them had damaged Britain's relationship with its most important ally. American politicians and public figures expressed support for the couple and criticism of the royal family. The couple's subsequent projects and public statements continued to reveal the extent of their mistreatment. Harry's memoir preparation and their documentary projects promised additional details about their experiences within the royal family, creating ongoing anxiety for palace officials who had no control over what might be revealed. The legal battle over Meghan's privacy case against the Mail on Sunday provided another avenue for exposing palace operations. Court documents revealed details about how palace communications staff had coordinated with journalists and how information about the royal family's private correspondence had been selectively leaked to support negative narratives about Meghan. The broader cultural impact of Harry and Meghan's revelations extended far beyond the royal family itself. Their story became a catalyst for conversations about racism, mental health, institutional power, and the treatment of women in public life. The couple had become symbols of resistance against systems that prioritize tradition over justice. Corporate partners and charitable organizations that had previously been eager to associate with the royal family began reassessing their relationships in light of the revelations about institutional racism and the treatment of Meghan. The monarchy's soft power and cultural influence were being eroded by the exposure of its internal operations. The long-term consequences of the campaign against Harry and Meghan were becoming clear. The palace had succeeded in driving them out of royal life, but at the cost of the monarchy's reputation and moral authority. The institution had revealed itself to be capable of cruel and vindictive behavior toward its own members, particularly those who challenged its traditional operations. The younger generation, in particular, was increasingly skeptical of the monarchy's values and relevance. Polling showed declining support for the royal family among people under 35, with many citing the treatment of Harry and Meghan as a factor in their changing attitudes toward the institution. The campaign against Meghan had also exposed the limitations of the monarchy's ability to adapt to modern expectations. Rather than embracing the diversity and fresh perspective she could have brought to the institution, the palace had chosen to eliminate what they saw as a threat to traditional hierarchies and operations. James O'Brien's analysis of the situation highlighted the systematic nature of the campaign and its broader implications for understanding how powerful institutions protect themselves. The royal family's treatment of Harry and Meghan provided a case study in how traditional power structures respond to challenges from outsiders, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds. The truth that emerged from Harry and Meghan's revelations was uncomfortable for those who preferred to see the monarchy as a benign and modernizing institution. Instead, their story revealed an organization capable of remarkable cruelty toward those who threatened its established order, regardless of their contributions or the personal cost of their treatment. The machine that had been designed to protect the monarchy had instead created a constitutional crisis that would define the institution for years to come. The campaign against Meghan had succeeded in its immediate goal of driving her out of royal life, but it had also exposed the palace's true nature to the world. As Harry and Meghan built their independent life in California, their story continued to reverberate through the British establishment and around the world. They had survived the royal machine's attempt to destroy them, but the cost had been enormous for all involved. The final lesson of their experience was perhaps the most important: institutions that prioritize their own survival over the well-being of the people they are supposed to serve ultimately undermine their own legitimacy and moral authority. The palace had won the battle against Harry and Meghan, but, in doing so, they had revealed themselves to be exactly the kind of institution that modern societies were increasingly unwilling to accept. The truth had finally come out, and there would be no going back for any of them.